We are to avoid always being plagued.
Disease, sexuality, and danger.
We know that their product kills tens of thousands of our citizens each year.
The agent of this disease was a very powerful industry.
I had no idea that 1 in 7 people will have a stroke during their lifetime. That was it.
Never before in history have we had such powerful weapons against disease, and we've come to depend on them. But this dependence has its risks, because we tend to think the causes and cures of our ills are simple. There are babies on this ward with diseases which tell parallel and tragic stories. Some of the babies have a terrifying new disease. Others an illness which burst upon Europe 500 years ago. It all began in the southern Italian city of Naples, where the people have always been known for their great love of life. At the end of the 15th century, Emperor Charles of France invaded Italy. After conquering Rome, his army moved south to the city of Naples. They met little resistance from the Neapolitans, who let the foreigners inside their walls. But the friendly Neapolitans took in more than they ever imagined. They welcomed the army with its retinue of camp followers into their homes and into their beds, and found themselves with a disease which would change the course of history. It was a terrible disease which no one had seen before.
Their bones would ache and crack. They would get fevers and they would get temperatures. They'd feel very tired. They'd develop a rash all over them.
And the body swelled, developed buboes, these open sores. The body began literally to rot away.
The disease which appeared in the 15th century was syphilis, and it arrived much like the new disease of the 1980s.
First you'd see one person, and then you'd see the signs in 2 or 3 people, and then you'd see more and more who had sort of gotten on that conveyor belt toward death. We had nothing in the context of our experience in terms of something as horrible and as brutal as what AIDS has become.
This new disease in the 1980s, AIDS, arrived uncannily like syphilis had in the 16th century. But it was so long ago, we'd forgotten the lessons.
At the end of the 15th century, syphilis hit Europe. There's a similarity here to how AIDS has come in the last 15 years to the Western world. This disease was seen for the first time. It occurred in predominantly young people. It occurred in people who were living in urban communities, in towns, in other words. They hadn't got any resistance to the disease. They were racked with other diseases like tuberculosis, like scurvy, near starvation. Now, people got ill much more severely than people get ill nowadays with early syphilis. People actually died at a fairly early stage.
As with AIDS today, when syphilis first appeared, there was no cure. But they did use the very unpleasant treatment, mercury.
But mercury at best is not very good treatment for syphilis. It works to a slight extent, but causes terrible side effects. It made your breath foul, it stopped your kidneys working properly, it made your teeth fall out, and it caused a very peculiar psychotic behavior. It's always thought the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland had mercury poisoning because hatters had to use mercury to rub into the rabbit skins when they were preparing hats.
I think people who were alive in the 15th century dealing with syphilis had a much easier time comprehending, conceiving of what an epidemic was. You've got to remember, for most of my generation, my distinct memory as a child was when we all stood up in our grade school gymnasiums one Sunday afternoon and we got our vaccines. And from that moment on, there was going to be nothing new under the sun in terms of diseases. Well, I got out of journalism school in 1975, and one of my first stories was to write about the big health problem in the gay community, which at that time was gonorrhea and syphilis.
Okay, today, right here, right now, you thought it was safe to walk this streets of San Francisco? No.
Gay men in San Francisco accepted that technology could solve anything, and there was nothing we really had to worry about. It was such a simple thing. You got syphilis, you got gonorrhea, you bent over and you got your shot, and that was that.
It's ironic that an epidemic of that old disease, syphilis, raged in those years before AIDS appeared. If only the medical authorities had tried harder to teach safe sex during the syphilis epidemic, instead of relying on penicillin, then the fertile ground for AIDS might not have existed.
It seemed that, year after year, every disease was getting more and more serious, and the numbers were just astronomical. And we could turn around today and say, my God, if only we had done something then.
But little was done then. And in a very short time, AIDS had spread across the globe. Not too different, in fact, from syphilis 500 years before, which also arrived because of international travel. It's thought that Columbus may have brought back syphilis from the New World, and there are suggestions that some of Columbus's sailors then fought with the French in Naples, taking their infection with them.
And as it spread throughout Europe, each national group not only saw it coming from another national group, but from a national group that they could see as being dangerous. The Neapolitans, of course, saw this as the French disease, and the French immediately saw it as the Neapolitan disease. And therefore, of course, it's never our sexuality that's at fault. It's always their sexuality that's at fault. It's never the straight or the gay. It's never the German or the French. It's always somebody else. And that's where danger lies. It lies across the border from who we think we are.
This is the 10 Eyewitness News.
The public school system will teach and train our children into deviant, unnatural homosexual activity.
I used to breed bulls, and until they got something better to do, they'd engage, they'd be homosexual,
He just had this outbreak of hysteria. It had everything to do with our social attitudes toward the people who got AIDS. It was a disease that was not only scary in its own right, but it was scarier because it was attached to these people who were foreign, who were alien, who were so different than we are. And that magnified the terror for people.
Undertakers' assistants are nervous about bodies infected with the AIDS virus. Two assistants had unwittingly handled the body of an AIDS victim at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital. Bans were immediately placed, and all AIDS victims who die in hospitals will be placed in sealed polythene bags, and undertakers' assistants are to wear full protective clothing.
Now, the people who did have a wonderful, philosophy into which AIDS fit perfectly were the fundamentalist Christians. And of course, they basically, have a medieval philosophy in which there is an avenging God that can smite down people who violate his laws with horrible plagues. And so when AIDS came along, AIDS fit in wonderfully from their point of view because they didn't like gays to start with, they didn't like sex to start with. So here was God coming and doing what he did in the days of Joshua in terms of killing his enemy.
King's Cross has become a centre of vice. A good time. With perverts and other people. A wild time. Without mentioning names. And on that day, we're going to have a centre of virtue instead of being a centre of vice.
both the Catholic Church and the new reformers in the north, Martin Luther and the other German Protestant reformers, saw this new disease, syphilis, as proof that the world was going to hell in a handbasket, that people were no longer in control of their bodies, of their sexualities. People were being punished for being lascivious. People were being punished for being sexually active.